Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I am joined by Dr. Jennifer Fraser. Jennifer is the author of The Bullied Brain and The Gaslit Brain. She is profoundly concerned about the world's normalizing of psychopathy and believes it's time we learned how to resist those who bully and gaslight. It's her mission to educate people on how to recognize and name these behaviors and stay safe when they show up. She talks in this episode about how if we can't name it, we can't experience it, and the impacts that that has on people who are abused but don't have the language and the struggles that they have later on. She believes that workplaces can become far kinder and healthier, and in doing so, also more productive and more profitable. And when we stop the dark triad from harming our minds, we are all better off for it. Dr. Fraser also writes a regular series for Psychology Today called The Bullied Brain and publishes those articles on Substack. This was a fun conversation. She and I could have gone on for a lot longer, but there's a ton in here just on what is gaslighting, what does it look like, what is going on in the gaslighter, what is going on in the victim, how to recognize it, how to get out of it, all kinds of different things. I think it's a great resource for people to just be armed with the information and the knowledge and the perspective, because once you're armed with it, then you can just navigate the world a little bit safer. She talks about it as armor for the brain, just to make sure that you aren't taken advantage of. So we are all working in dynamic environments with other people, whether that's the business that we work in and we show up to every day, the team that our kids are participating in, the school they go to. And unfortunately, there are abusers and bad actors out there. And so this kind of thing is important for everybody, adults and children, to know, to be aware of, and know how to avoid and navigate through. So I hope you find this a helpful resource. It was a very fun conversation, even though it is a very dark topic. Here is Dr. Jennifer Fraser. Jen, welcome to the show. You and I have already been going here. So we were like, wait, hold on. We got to hit play on this. So I'm excited to dive into this topic today. I think the word gaslighting gets thrown around quite a bit, but I want to make sense with you today because you're the expert. What does it actually mean? What does it feel like or sound like when it shows up? And how do we combat against it? Because people who are using this behavior can be very sneaky. Excited to have you on. Just to jump in, let's just start at the beginning. What is gaslighting? Also, what is it not? I think, are people getting anything wrong when they say, oh, I was gaslit?
Yeah, it's the key question, really. And it's such a specific and destructive behavior. I think it's very important that we understand and are clear on what exactly is it. So in 2022, gaslighting was the word of the year from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. And the reason being, it was looked up 1,740% more often. So gaslighting has become a concern that all of us have right now, obviously. And they define it very specifically for our era. Words, they don't remain the same once they're first used. And this is a really interesting component of how words change their meaning. And gaslighting has changed its meaning. It used to be, and it originally from the 1940s, when it entered into popular consciousness, it was really applied to interpersonal relationships, like marriages specifically, or romances. And it would be when one partner would gaslight the other partner, and they would very specifically break them down and make them lose trust in their own sanity. And they would literally come to believe that actually they were unhinged. They were deranged. They couldn't trust themselves. And this was a way for the partner to take power over them for whatever reason. And the original one was financial. They wanted to steal something that belonged to the partner, the wife, and their goal was to make the wife think she was completely crazy so that they could take the jewels. What was the simple part of it? And luckily there was a Hollywood policeman there, and so everything got sorted out in the favor of the wife. So this has been the meaning. It's gone on through time, and it's actually now, in the 21st century, entering into lawsuits between couples in a marriage, where it is starting to be in a judge's ruling that in actual fact, the one partner very consciously gaslit the other. Okay, so here's where we come to Merriam-Webster, and it's really interesting. So 2022, word of the year, and here's how they define it. They say that gaslighting is the act or practice of grossly misleading someone, especially for one's own personal advantage. Now, that's where the kicker comes in for me. So going back, O'Brien, to the idea of, okay, what's not gaslighting, as I specifically point out in the book, I say, for my definition and how I apply the word in the workplace, I only apply it when the person is manipulating, they're telling falsehoods, and it's for a personal agenda.
Could that personal agenda also be an organizational agenda?
Absolutely. And that's really what I look at. So if you look at the title of my book, the subtitle that people don't pay attention to, this really gets to the heart of it. I'm looking at lying, basically. I look at the lies that are used in bullying, the lies that are using gaslighting, and then very specifically organizational culture, the lies that are used in institutional complicity.
And what I hear you say is there needs to be some room for mistakes because humans make mistakes. But when there's motive and intent, when there's a potential motive, that's where maybe you want to look a little bit closer to see, is this actually gaslighting versus a mistake, and try to come up with, is there actual intent?
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that, because when it comes to brain science, that's one of the really complicated parts of gaslighting. Because what I try to show in the book is, and when I work with leaders, I work with leadership, I say to them, I can train you not to gaslight yourself. Because what we can do with our brains is, and this is complicated, but I'm just going to give you the short version. If people actually care about the brain science, there's lots of research in the book, but just between you and me, short version here. What happens is, imagine you're the leader of a company and you hear a report that your top salesman, your friend, you played squash with this guy, you and your wife have traveled with him and his wife, or her and her husband, whatever, and you're hearing that they're highly abusive. And your first thought of your brain is, no way. You can't help that. That happens automatically. Your brain goes, that's not real. It's not real because I've never seen her behave that way. She's never done that. And I know her well. She's my friend. Our kids are friends. I've never seen that. So this is where you start to go astray, because what actually is happening is you're dealing with, and this is very much the gaslighting persona, you're dealing with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it's really hard for the human brain to understand that there's two different operations happening simultaneously in one human being. That doesn't make sense to the brain. And the brain can't operate that way. It would take too many resources for us to meet every single person we work with and say to ourselves, is this Dr. Jekyll and there's actually a Mr. Hyde behind closed doors? Because I don't have that bandwidth for that. I need to trust. I need to trust all my people. Now, what you don't realize as a leader is, let's pretend you are dealing with Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and you've only ever seen Dr. Jekyll. You don't know that behind closed doors there's harassment going on or abuse or fraud or any of these things. And you just don't know, but you've been hearing rumbling and rumors. And the first time you heard the report, you said, no way. There's no way he or she did that. And you bring them in and you're like, so-and-so, did you do this? And they're like, oh my God, I feel awful. This is terrible. I never would have done that. I think there's a terrible misunderstanding. So-and-so we know that they tend to exaggerate. And these are called counterfacts in neuroscience. And counterfacts are what you produce when you cannot deal with what actually might be happening. So benefit of the doubt, right? You're empathic, you care, you're a leader. You're like, okay, I'm going to deal with this problem employee, frankly. I don't want people's reputation tarnished where I work. This is my top salesperson. Then the next year you get another report and you're like, oh. And then the third year you get another one. And then you say to yourself, I see a pattern. I'm going to destroy the evidence that I've had a series of reports, because guess what? I'm negligent and I'm
Because now I look
complicit.
bad. Yeah.
I'm complicit. And this happens to good leaders all the time. Nobody goes into or very few go into a huge leadership role and say to themselves, I'm going to cover up abuse on my watch.
Yeah. Some might, but most don't.
Some might.
So it seems to me like anytime we have the thought, this could never happen, like that should be a check. Like we should just check ourselves on that. Because if we're sitting there saying, this person could never do this thing that lots of people throughout history have done, but this person could never, like anyone could do anything. And even if they're a close friend of ours. And so I don't like, we don't need to throw them under the bus right away, but at least we need to create space for the possibility that what we're hearing is true.
Exactly. And there are things that leaders can do, organizations can do to prevent ever being in that position. So, one of the key things that I advise people do is send out anonymous surveys every 6 months. Hear from the people. You should know exactly what's going on in every single room in your organization if you're a leader. And if you start to see a pattern, it's the pattern that speaks. It's not the he said, she said. No,
Yeah.
it's the pattern. Because if you do have an individual in your workplace who's a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, who is part of the dark triad, who actually has a damaged brain, which they do, and we could talk more about that. It's pretty tragic. I try to sidestep the whole morality piece. That doesn't interest me, and that's not where I work. I work in the medical lens. I apply the medical, specifically neuroscience lens to these things. I say, what is going on in the brain? What's going on in the brain of the perpetrator? What goes on in the brain of the victim? And what goes on in the brain of the leader who finds themselves complicit? That's where I think we can do a lot of transformative, really positive and healthy change.
So let's back up just a little bit here, back to setting the table on this stuff. So if gaslighting is all about breaking down our trust in our own thoughts and beliefs and observations, what does that start to look like? What might be the signs that the way somebody's communicating, the things that they're saying are manipulative and are trying to mess with us?
I'll give you an example of what happened to me in the workplace, because this is where it began. This is where I started to say, I'm an academic researcher. So when it happened to me, I was like, my first question was, what happened there? That was shocking. And then over time, I started to research it. And what I found is really interesting. So I was working as an educator. I was a teacher in a school. This is a university prep school, independent school. And so extremely wealthy, costs anywhere from $30,000 to $80,000 or $100,000 for a year to go there. Yep. Well-established school, but I don't want you to think public school. I want you to think this is a corporation. This is a very expensive, highly financed place. So I was a big believer, and I believed in this place, and I worked there for 8 years. And I heard from a number of people, upwards of 30 people, that abuse was occurring. And it involved 4 teachers, and these teachers were my colleagues. So it was a very uncomfortable and painful situation to be put in. But the bottom line is I have legal duty to report. And so I went to the board first, then I went to the administration, and I reported. And then there's a regulator that you have to report to. I went to my boss, essentially, and there we are. We've talked 1,000 times. I've worked there. I'm an award-winning teacher, sitting there. And I said to him, okay, so this is happening. The 4 teachers that were abusing were doing it under the auspices of coaching basketball. So it was a lot of extreme verbal abuse, psychological abuse, it was just classic abuse culture, which people should understand. Abuse culture operates. It doesn't matter if it's in a school or in a family or all the way up to a huge multinational company. It's always the same. And it's really quite simple, but we seem to struggle with it in society. We normalize it a lot. But basically, a bullying culture results from fear. So you terrorize the people you're dealing with. And this is part of the gaslighting. You make people afraid. You humiliate them. This is part of the gaslighting process as well, O'Brien, as you would recognize. When you humiliate people, you're telling them you're worthless. You don't belong. These kinds of classic bullying statements that people use. And then favoritism is the key. Some people get put up in pedestals, and they oftentimes don't earn these positions. They're granted these positions because it consolidates the power of the abuser. And then the final one's retaliation. If you dare to speak up, if you assert yourself, if you say, just a second, the way I live in reality doesn't allow for this, you crossed a line, any of these things, it gets thrown back in your face. You get retaliation. You're told that you're the problem, and you're oftentimes scapegoated. You'll get fired or punished or driven out. You'll be smear campaigned. Terrible things will happen to you if you dare to say, yeah, this is not okay. So I did not know any of these things as I went up to my boss and I said, this is happening. This is being reported to me, upwards of 30 people. I'm really concerned. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, what? He said, that's just old school coaching. And let me just be very clear. I'm sure you do not want very ugly language on the podcast, but I'm just going to say, I am
Let her
repeating.
rip.
Can I go? Okay. These teachers were calling the students things like fucking retards, fucking pussies, fucking soft, grow some balls, and then wrapped all in with all kinds of other abuses. And they were doing things like yelling in a kid's face repeatedly in scenes of public humiliation, the same kid, same target over and over again. And the students described it as vicious. The kid would try to get away and the teacher would grab them by the arm or the jersey and hold them in for more in the face yelling. I want people to really understand, I wasn't reporting, oh, so-and-so is not being, treated fairly. I was reporting like, whoa, this is teachers. You can't do that.
Yeah. Having played sports growing up in the 90s, and I was the victim of some foul language myself. But I think especially, and your stories in the book, like when you get to singling somebody out, humiliating them in front of another team, like that is especially where it gets, okay, this isn't just somebody's language choice. This is manipulating the person's emotions.
And here's where the gaslighting part's really interesting, because my guess would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, you might have heard foul language with coaches who were losing their cool. And we all know that we can all lose our cool and yell and scream and say things we regret and be sorry after. And that's just human beings. We do it with our kids. As parents, we would die for our kids. We still can lose our cool. I get that. But that's not what this was. And the biggest clicker for this is they had no desire to win. Winning was used as the umbrella over what gave them carte blanche. And you see this in organizational culture. I'm allowed to maltreat people because it's about the bottom line. I can maltreat people for the shareholders. I can do all kinds of abusive things because really what I'm doing is serving the organization, this larger idea. So this is a very microcosm version of it. They're trying to pretend that they want to win high school championships, which was all a lie. It was, as soon as you watch them actually, how the choices that they made as coaches, it was very obvious that they were sabotaging the kids every single game. They weren't playing their best players.
Yeah. So you talked about this in the book, winning the inner game versus winning the actual game, and how people who fall into this behavior, they wind up playing these sort of weird, sick inner psychology games versus focusing on the actual game that everybody should be playing together. Can you talk a little more about that and what's going on in our brains when that happens?
Yeah, it's the term that's used by the experts who study the dark triad. And just to be clear for everybody, dark triad is shorthand in psychology for narcissists, Machiavellians, and psychopaths. So we'll just shorthand it to psychopath. So the psychopathic brain, which you can identify on a brain scan, it's very interesting. They're described as having a game-like fascination with winning, but the winning is for themselves. They're so psychologically hurt and their brains are so damaged, which you can see on a brain scan, that they are driven to take some of the pain and pressure away by triumphing over others. They're always trying to be the winner in situations, regardless of what it is. So if you want to win in your marriage, that means you're going to have all the jewels. And you don't care if your partner gets put in an asylum, right? That's not how marriages normally win.
Yeah, that's not winning a marriage.
But that as it is for the psychopath.
Yeah. So have you read The Status Game?
No.
I read that book after listening to the author on a podcast, and it shaped a lot of my thinking. That it made the claim that the thing we are all after pretty much all the time is status. And I was like, no, that can't be. Like, we can't all be after status all the time. I don't operate that way. Like, other people don't operate that way. And then I read the book and I was like, oh, we are all after status all the time. It's just that we're all playing different status games. We all, if you think of status as a heightened sense of self-esteem, right? A position of esteem in whatever group or category you can think of, that would be status. And so when I hear you say that, I think back to this is like, these people want to elevate their own status. The game they're playing is, I'm going to elevate my status over you. They're ignoring the broader game. They're like, we're trying to win a basketball game, or we're trying to stay in business, or I would like to keep my marriage long term. I think the other thing is like, there's finite and infinite games. Simon Sinek has the book The Infinite Game, which was based on a book from the 70s called Finite and Infinite Games. And it's like, we often think of games as finite. There's an endpoint, there's a winner, there's a loser. But a lot of the games that we're playing are infinite. A marriage is an infinite game. You don't win marriage. You only win marriage by staying married. You don't win business. You win business by staying in business and continuing to conduct your business. And so I think a lot of people are trying to win status in a finite game when they are actually playing an infinite game. And that does a lot of damage.
Yeah. What you just described beautifully. There was a fantastic book that came out last year called The Dark Pattern. I don't know if you've read it. In The Dark Pattern, it's written by two Swiss business professors. And what they do, which is pretty daring, is they talk about companies that have self-destructed, as you describe, many of them, if not all of them. And they talk about this particular model of the CEO. So the CEO comes in and they do all of these various things that they identify as the dark pattern. So if you look at Boeing, for example, we could use one example, and all of the legality of it had to be gone over with a fine-tooth comb because it was pretty, talking about huge corporate entities. But they show this pattern. And one of the features of the pattern they call manipulative language. And in discussion with them, I've been like, oh, it's gaslighting. What's happening here? And we've had some great conversations about it. But the CEO that comes in and says, I'm going to get all this money for shareholders, and you're going to pay me the most enormous salary anyone's ever heard of, $230 million this year. And you're going to pay that to me because I'm going to take this company, and it's all about finite short-term gain, but that's not what they say. They take a venerable company like Boeing, which originally was all engineers, and they say to the engineers, we don't have any resources for you. You're going to have to work double time. You're going to have to compromise your standards. We don't have time for safety. And the next thing you know, you have a disaster on your hands, and a tragic disaster. And they show a whole series of companies that have followed this pattern, but that is a real world example of exactly what you're talking about. Now, where I would be interested in this idea of status, I think for someone like myself, and perhaps this is true for you, I get status from collaborating with the team and making it be a win for all of us together. That's how I am in my marriage as well. It's a win for my family if we all care for each other and no one is higher than someone else and no sibling is privileged over another. And the husband and the wife, or however their partnerships are, it's about the team. It's about our family unit. And when I win, we all win. When you win, we all win. It's like that kind of idea. That is not happening for the psychopathic brain.
Yeah. Well, and I would bet that you also feel some moral status there too, right? Like, hey, I'm not above anybody else, which actually puts me in a high status position because I feel good about myself because I put myself on an even playing field. So it's like weird to say that you get status from putting yourself on an even playing field, and that elevates you not above other people, but it elevates you. And we have a heightened sense of our own self-esteem because we make some of those beliefs.
Okay, so you just said a really important brain science thing.
By accident, I promise.
The way I would interpret that from the brain science is what we know from the research is if they put the two of us into fMRI scanners and they looked at both of our brains simultaneously and they were cutting my hand, and you could observe this. You could see that they were cutting my hand and you could see that I was in a lot of pain. What's really fascinating is that would activate your pain system in your brain. It would light up.
Yeah.
And you can't help that. That's unconscious. It would light up your empathy neural network, and that's your affective empathy neural network. The affective empathy neural network allows you to feel my pain, literally. So your brain would light up the same as mine, and you would feel my pain. And what's really interesting is it would be muted. So your brain wouldn't be feeling the agony of what I was feeling. It would be feeling just enough to go and help me. And that's how our brains were designed by evolution. Now, what happens to the psychopathic brain, which is really awful, is, and it's more complex than this. And this is for conversation. There's really complex science on this. But in general, we can make the generalization no problem based on neuroscientific research. People who become very unempathic, where they don't feel anything for people, they don't feel their pain, they don't walk in their shoes, they can hurt creatures and they can hurt people without batting an eye, and they sleep perfectly afterwards. There's no anguish, there's no guilt, there's no remorse, none of that. They don't feel it. And you can see that on a brain level. They usually come from abuse and neglect in their formative years. So when people come from abuse and neglect, their brains get really badly hurt. So my sort of dream vision of the future going forward, now that we have this brain science, we have to get much better, first of all, at protecting kids and educating parents and educating caregivers and ensuring that kids don't go through that in childhood so that we can have healthier, happier, more high-performing adults.
Yeah. So in the book, you talk about the dark triad and you use the word psychopath or psychopathy or something like that. And what I hear you just giving that overview of these people who can hurt an animal and sleep well at night. And I think that's what we think of when we think of like psychopath. And when somebody treats us poorly, we want to think that they're this evil person. But the reality is, like you talked about earlier, there's this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing going on. And so it feels like this is more of a spectrum. I almost worry that talking about psychopaths hurts this conversation a little bit. And I would love you to push back on this. I feel like it hurts this conversation a little bit because most people are not psychopaths, even if they're doing something wrong. They're not like true psychopaths. Whereas like somebody who's done some good stuff can also be a gaslighter and abuser in certain situations. And so we don't need to be looking for these people who are like psychotic. We need to be just aware that anyone around us could do something like this. I would love if I'm mistaken there, but I just would love your reaction to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, everything, if you ever read a neuroscientist, they are the most cautious people in terms of science and the research and what they say. They will always say it suggests that. So let's keep that kind of language for sure. But then, of course, there's a spectrum for everything. And what I think is really interesting for people to understand is our brains are neuroplastic. So every single one of us has huge personal accountability in that if we see ourselves going down a path where our empathy is getting eroded, you want to do everything in your power to get it back online, fire it back up, do the kind of work you need, take the 6 months off. You think addiction is an issue, empathy erosion, affective empathy erosion is the most dangerous thing that could happen to you. It could destroy your life. But if you think the public consciousness will say, oh, the psychopath has to be a serial killer and this is what they do. No. Just think about a priest, for example, a religious figure that dresses in the robes of, I am a religious figure and I'm going to hear your confession and I'm going to put on the Dr. Jekyll persona, no problem. But behind closed doors, I'm abusing children. That's really what we're talking about. A lot of people listening to this would be my guess. They can instantly think of a person that they know that's in their workplace or that they have maybe in their family or a friend or a romantic partner that they've been engaged with where they've seen these types of behaviors that really aren't normal and they aren't on a spectrum and they don't happen to anybody. And they're not a way that someone will manifest and then recover. So the way I distinguish it, and I've written an article about this for Psychology Today, because you're asking a very, very hard question. I've had really great debates with some of my colleagues about how do we define this then? And the way we've come up with, and the way I write about in the article, is there's two types of abuser. There's the abrasive abuser. That's the person that loses their cool. And all of us can be that person. All of us have been that person, would be my guess. I certainly have. You lose it and you get volcanic and you act in ways that you never normally would, and you're mortified afterwards. And you hurt people like your own kids, you yell at them or you say something, and you're so full of misery about it. You apologize, you're full of misery. Now, that's the abrasive abuser. We've all had someone in the workplace who's lost it and yelled and screamed and carried on and done something horrible or panicked and covered something up or all relatable.
Made a mistake.
Made a terrible mistake, really terrible. We've all been there. Now, where that differs from is there's the abrasive abuser and there's the abusive abuser. The abusive perpetrator is someone whose affective empathy is offline and they're not getting it back. And they, in fact, deeply believe that they're the victim. So they don't go and get the help they need. If you confront them as a leader and you say, look, report number 1, year 1, I gave you the benefit of the doubt. Report number 2, I sent you to workshops and you said you were going to work on it and that you were deeply sorry. Report number 3, I've got a problem here. And the person looks you in the eye and says, this is a witch hunt. That's where you're like, just a second here. And a lot of this happens very quickly and it throws off the normal brain. It's referred to in the literature as Jennifer Fraser is the scholar who came up with this, so the psychologist, she calls it DARVO. So the first thing you'll get with one of these individuals is full-on denial. I never did that. Denial. Then you will get DARVO. Attack. You attack the perpetrator, you attack the leader, you say, I'm going to sue you for defamation. You are on full-on attack mode. The person that's saying this is X, Y, or Z, they're hysterical, they're unhinged, whatever. And then this is the part that's so confusing to the brain. And leaders can be trained not to let this happen. There's a reversal that takes place very quickly. Reverse, victim, and offender. DARVO. Deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. So that's what the witch hunt is.
So what is reverse and what was the last one? Reverse?
Victim and offender.
Victim. So I get victim. I would guess what would be reverse and what would be offender?
Okay. So the offender is, we'll use the abusive employee. So let's pretend the employee is sexually harassing the person they're supposed to mentor. They're sexually harassing them. And this is not the first time this is being reported. This is the third time this is being reported. And the leader is looking at the person who's got this report that's come in year after year. And the person says, you know what? If you go public with this, I'm going to sue you for defamation. These are lies. Look at #MeToo. That movement was around a whole bunch of women in the workplace going, hey, when I reported Harvey Weinstein, I was made to sign an NDA and told to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to work in the industry. That's reversal between victim, I'm victimized, and now you are making me another layer through the institutional complicity. You are re-victimized. You're not dealing with the offender. Look at Dr. Larry Nassar. Dr. Larry Nassar abused kids for 30 years. And every single time he was called on the carpet for this or that, or with the FBI, the administration, other coaches, they all covered up for him. They were offended that the victim, a kid, would have spoken up or the parent tried to protect the kid.
Yeah. You're making the victim the perpetrator.
Exactly. You almost can't say the sentence because it's very hard for the brain to understand Jekyll and Hyde as well.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
All the time.
You see it in every abuse trial, right? That is one of the tactics.
Yes. We had a trial.
What would
like that in
offender
Canada.
be then? What would offender be then?
The
Would
offender
they
is
take ownership of it?
The offender doesn't take ownership. If you have the damaged brain of the narcissist, Machiavellian, and psychopath, you can't take accountability because you are that damaged.
So what does offender mean then?
The perpetrator of the abuse.
Okay, I think I misunderstood. So in DARVO, those are the behaviors that you see. You see them deny, you see them attack. And so what is offender? What does that behavior look like?
Well, it can take the form of any kind of abuse. It can be...
Saying that is the actual abuse.
It's the abuser.
Got it.
And the institution will often comply. The reason why the leader goes along with DARVO and they will fire the person who spoke up. They won't fire the offender. The perpetrator doesn't get fired. The whistleblower gets fired. The truth teller, shoot the messenger because the leader doesn't want to hear it. And the leader's brain is very specifically not hearing this. If you read the research on this, there's two parts of the brain that are operating. One's called the experiencing brain, and the other part's called the remembering brain. The remembering brain cares about your legacy. It cares about the future self, and it will make you forget things like aversive things. You won't remember them, literally won't remember them because it doesn't serve your future self. So imagine you're a leader and you have these victims that come to you and they say, this is what's happened to us. And it happened on your watch, and it means you're negligent, and you actually should resign. And you refuse to do that. Instead, you scapegoat these people. and you fire them. You get rid of them and you pay them out and you make them disappear, because that allows you to maintain the story of yourself as a decent hero. And this is, I'm literally using the language of the neuroscientists, the psychologists, the people that write about this. This is how our
Yeah.
brains function. So again, if we go back to that question of morality, we're not choosing a lot of these things. We can be made aware of them and we can train our brains not to do them. But in our normalized culture where the brain is not really talked much about, we don't even know that we're susceptible to this.
Isn't this a weird part of our sort of society today as well, that like when we catch something bad happening, we immediately go to the leader and go, you need to resign because of this. We don't say you need to correct this behavior and prove that you've corrected it. We say you need to resign, in which you're only going to get a reaction where they dig in, right? That's not necessarily going to help. Like I always think, like I would want to call on these people to fix the problem. And then if they fix the problem, good for them. That shows their character. And let's give people a chance to fix their problems as leaders. Maybe they didn't know, or maybe it was easy to look the other way for whatever reason. And now suddenly it's caught their attention and they're like, you're right, I was wrong. Let me go fix this. We'll fire all the abusers. It just seems like the people who are catching this stuff struggle with that, like that person needs to resign immediately, like that being the default attack mode. I don't think that's as productive as it could be.
No, I don't either. And one of the best examples of how that worked beautifully, exactly as you're describing, is Nike. So Nike had a huge issue with misogyny. Basically, the female employees were being maltreated in a whole variety of ways. And the women got together and they sent out their own survey. They said, we're sick of this. They're driving out some of the best female employees at Nike, and we're sick of it. We don't want to be treated this way. They did their own survey because surveys weren't being done. The CEO should have known about this, but he wasn't issuing these kind of surveys. They did it themselves. They brought it to the CEO, and the CEO did not blame them, shame them, tell them that they had done something terrible by doing their own survey. They should have spoken to him first. You can think of all the cover-up options he had on the table. He didn't. He did exactly what you said. He said, you know what? Thank you for this. And he fired the perpetrators. Got rid of them. I don't want men working for me that are like this. I don't care how high performing they are or what buddies they are with me. They're gone. I've got all this data. And that's really healthy, and it's how workplaces should be, and it's how leaders should be trained. But tons of leaders do not get any training, certainly on the neuroscience and the neuroscience of abuse. They might learn neuroscience around how to be highly productive and how to do this and that, but they're not hearing, okay, abuse culture, it's a reality. We have to tackle it. It's not the most fun thing to tackle, but it could protect you, your organization, and your people. Why wouldn't you learn this?
Yeah. So I feel like there's a slow on-ramp to gaslighting. Like I don't, maybe this happens sometimes, but I feel like it's not usually somebody comes in and they're just like a bull in a china shop right away. And then all of a sudden everybody's covering up for them. There's some grooming that's happening here. They're building the right friendships in the right places. They're abusing in small ways, almost like test abuses here and there. Can you talk about how this builds and maybe how we start to recognize it earlier?
Yeah, the perfect word you used was grooming. So that's one of the things, if I'm working with leaders, I teach them right off the bat. I say, at the same time that the abusive individual is grooming their targets, they are grooming you, especially you. They're grooming HR, they're grooming the powerful people, and they're grooming the popular people. It's part of this game fascination with winning. That's actually how they operate. That's where they put their energy. They're not interested in the work at all. They're interested in the game. And also, what's really interesting about what you said is one of the really interesting pieces of research that's come out in recent years is they've studied people who are pathological liars. And what they've learned is when you tell a self-serving lie the first time, it activates the threat response in your brain. So your amygdala, the threat response goes, hey, wait a second. What you're doing is, ooh, you're crossing a social line. This is making me panic. I don't like this. Hold on. The more you tell self-serving lies, the less the amygdala reacts. It just goes, oh, I guess this is business as usual. I'm going to step down. And one of the most dangerous things our brains do, and it's part of this larger piece of how we all need to learn about this, and the idea of we all are striving for status in one way, shape, or another. We're all very much the same with our very similar brains. One of the things that we have to understand is how our brains are susceptible to what's called habituation. So
Yeah.
anyone who's ever driven a car for 30 years, 20 years, 10 years even, we all know habituation. It's how we drive without thinking about driving anymore. Our brains are expected to do amazing things 24/7, and they get exhausted. They don't have endless resources. So they're really adept at putting things on autopilot that happen all the time. So driving is actually a super dangerous thing that we do, but we put it on autopilot because our brains do it so often. The best historical example of this, of how much our brains can habituate, think of organizational culture to anything, is the Nazi era. The Nazi era made it normal to send your neighbors off to their death with their kids. That became so normal. Hannah Arendt famously called it banality of evil, but we are all susceptible to banality of evil. Just as you described in the workplace, all of us can very easily look the other way when bad things go on or fraudulent things go on or little tiny sort of grooming behaviors are happening. And it's our workplace, it's our livelihood. Are we really going to cause it? That's the job of the leader. We tell ourselves many things, but basically we go onto autopilot to protect ourselves and our brain resources. And it's dangerous.
Yeah. I don't know if this is related or not, but just thinking about grooming for any kind of abuser, I feel like there are some patterns early. And I like the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing because somebody might be treating us a certain way, but paying attention to how they treat other people could be very important too. It's like, how does somebody treat the help at the restaurant? I remember my wife got a job and was working with this new group of people, and there was somebody who was very, I don't want to say affectionate, but very complimentary of her, a man, and told her how much he enjoyed working with her and was very nice to her, that they were spending time together. And then I showed up because she was on this tour. And so they had been off working and we were just married. And so then I came to visit and I went to meet the guy and he wouldn't talk to me. And it was like he had been so vocal about how he felt about her. But then when he met me, it was, oh, hello. Yeah, nice to meet you. Okay, cool. One word answers. And then he would physically excuse himself from the conversation. It happened 2 or 3 times. There was another guy who she was partnered with who was doing similar behavior, very flattering language with her, very complimentary, really enjoyed working with her. And then when I showed up, I got a big hug. He told me how great she was. He told me how much he liked working with her. Like all the things he had said to her, he said to me. And it was so clear that the first guy was setting himself up for something and the second guy was genuine. And I told her that. And I said, look, I love this guy, but you got to watch out for that guy. And lo and behold, it came out later that while he was on this tour with his wife and his newborn and was unfaithful and doing all kinds of bad behavior. And so it was that inconsistency. That was a glaring example where in one visit, I got to see yin and yang like that clearly, but it just taught me the lesson of looking for those inconsistencies as red flags. Even if it's somebody that I genuinely like, if that person had treated me well, it might be harder for me to see how they're treating somebody else negatively. But being able to just be aware of how everybody's treating everybody and those consistencies or inconsistencies in behavior is a good indication of whether I need to have my guard up or not.
It's interesting you would tell that story because in this school, I had never seen my colleagues behave in any way other than being funny, nice, hardworking. I'd never seen them swear or call anybody a name, put somebody down, yell in their face, grab them, detain them from more yelling. I'd never seen them being completely unfair, not meritocracy based. Like I'd never seen any of those behaviors. So I had to do a deep dive into the research to find answers because society was not supplying the answers. We don't get trained in these things. And I resigned in protest from that school. I wasn't going to work at a place that was covering up abuse. There's just no way. I went to another school, another private school. I can only teach in a private school because I have a PhD and not a teacher's certificate. So I can't work in public schools. So I went from one extremely expensive, high profile private school to another one. And at the other school, I encountered a similar thing, except that it was sexual abuse. And again, the whole thing was covered up. It was covered up by the regulator even. It's quite endemic in our society. And I think it's such a painful conversation that a lot of people just don't want to go there. Leaders don't want to go there. But the reality is the more we shine a spotlight, and we especially, I feel like if we use the science, then it allows us to have these types of conversation where we say, if you understand how the brain works, then you can make your brain really strong and really healthy and highly empathic, which is how you lead a successful and fulfilling life. Or you can allow brains all over the place to get harmed. And we know that bullying and gaslighting, very normalized in our culture, actually do physical damage to brain architecture. You can see it on a brain scan. I would say the vast majority of the population doesn't know that. And
So
so we
what
allow
so
bullying.
if it's doing brain damage, what are the physical manifestations of that? Or I guess what are the mental manifestations of that too? What then happens to the victims of gaslighting and bullying?
Okay, so I'll give you 3 examples and I'll circle back to the amygdala because it's a good, easy one to get a handle on. So let's pretend we're looking at a brain scan of somebody who's being yelled at by their peer. They've been bullied by a peer or bullied by a parent. They've never been touched. There's no physical abuse and there's no sexual abuse. And we take a look at their brain after a year of this kind of maltreatment. What is a brain that is highly compromised, damaged, like you would if they had been sexually and physically abused. So what is the corpus callosum, for example? It is the connector. It's a bundle of fibers that connects the left and right hemisphere. The left and right hemisphere are very different in how they approach reality, and they need to be communicating all the time. It's critical for us to even function, to have our left and right working together. And if your corpus callosum gets demyelinated by this type of maltreatment, humiliation, it gets demyelinated, which means the insulator gets eroded on it. So you can't communicate very well. Like the electrical attempt of the brain to talk to each other, the two hemispheres, isn't working. So that compromises all kinds of things that you might want to do. Another example would be the hippocampus. So the brain is a vast network that works always together, but just for the sake of this conversation, we isolate the hippocampus, we look at it on a brain scan, you'll see it's all shriveled. It shouldn't be shriveled, it should be plush. It's the seat of learning and memory. So you know how when kids are being bullied in school, their marks drop? Their marks don't drop because they're feeling bad. Their marks drop because their brain is being damaged. It's getting hurt.
Can't physically retain the information.
They can't do all kinds of things because their hippocampus is soaking up a bunch of cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, totally natural and healthy, except if you're in this situation where you're constantly being attacked, your body is releasing adrenaline and cortisol. Cortisol is not only damaging your brain, it's damaging your blood vessels. That's why people who are in abuse situations have very compromised hearts often. They have high blood pressure. They have autoimmune disorders. This is all well documented in the medicine, that these kinds of abuses lead to these types of medical conditions, chronic illnesses, and shortened lifespan. But we don't operate with this knowledge in our society. So let's go back, though, to the amygdala. So the amygdala is somebody who grows up in a lot of chaos and attacks and verbal attacks, and they don't know where it's coming from, and it's horrible. Their amygdala will oftentimes get enlarged. And when the amygdala gets enlarged, it becomes, what does it look like in life? Hypervigilant. You sit down beside a guy in a bar who's got a very enlarged amygdala from all the violence he's been exposed to through childhood and into his life. And you sit down and you look over the bartender, you glance at him, you're just caging the joint, whatever. And he turns to you and he goes, "What are you looking at?" Because his amygdala is ready to act. And then cut to 5 minutes later, he thinks you've disrespected him and he's punched you in the face. That's an enlarged amygdala. And those people are like, they're like 1 second from going into massive amounts of rage. This was one of these things that the kids reported to teachers. 1 minute they're laughing and talking. Next minute, they're screaming obscenities. And they were like, what is that? But they didn't even have the language to report it. We don't teach kids about this.
Yeah. That's so interesting, the physical damage that can be done from just the way other people treat us. And I think it's important to remember too that this is what happens to all of us.
Yeah.
And so I think there's like a shame that comes with being a victim of some of this abuse, which is I couldn't handle it. You know, I'm weak in some way because I couldn't handle it. I should have been better. And I think we need to do away with that somehow.
You just gave a beautiful example of gaslighting. So if you think the personal gaslighting one person to another, you think social gaslighting, organizational gaslighting, we are so steeped in gaslighting and how we think about these things that we self-doubt. You know, what my son said that really amazed me because he was a victim of these teachers. He actually didn't say this to me. He said this on national news when he spoke to national news about what had been done to him. He said, sometimes I think the kid's 18 or 19 saying this. He goes, sometimes I thought to myself, maybe I am a pussy. Because you see how it's designed, right? It's designed for you to think that, and this is reversal of offender and victim. You scream and yell at me and tell me I'm a blithering idiot or whatever, I'm stupid and you never want to work with me. And I walk home and I go, I'm failing. I'm not doing a good job. My boss thinks I'm less than. I'm not worthy and I don't belong.
Yeah.
Right? So
Well, and
I've
the really
absorbed.
sad thing is like our brains are programmed to do that anyway. Like we all have self-doubt. And
Yes.
so it's easy for this to slip in there because we all are thinking some of those things anyway. And if somebody can say something that sort of triggers one of those things that we've maybe been worried about ourselves, like maybe I am a wimp. When somebody goes, you're a wimp, you're like, oh, see, maybe I
Well,
am. And then it can build on itself. One of the best things I think you can do is just build a strong sense of self and keep an open mindset that even if you have weaknesses now, that doesn't mean that you can't grow from those weaknesses. I just getting in the, oh, I am this bad thing. It's something we all go to, and it's something we all need to work to get out of.
so the most important part 3 of the Gaslit Brain is designed to help people train their brains to be powerful. Train their brains not to fall for gaslighting and not to fall for bullying because it's all a pack of falsehoods. First of all, like why would you allow someone to manipulate your actual brain? But the key thing that is so important about what you said is most people don't know we actually can strengthen our brains. There is brain training that we can do it's called Brain HQ. It was all over the news like 2 or 3 weeks ago, international news, 200 outlets, because they're now able to show that Brain HQ, all you need to do is half an hour a day. It doesn't cost anything barely. It's just brain training though. And it's designed by neuroscientists. The lead scientist is Dr. Michael Merzenich, who I work with, who's just the most amazing individual. But the bottom line is they can show now that it pumps up acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is one of the things that's the healthiest for your brain cells. It keeps them from aging and atrophying and getting old and not functioning well. So all of our kids from 12 on and all of us should be putting in as much time into our half an hour a day of brain training like we do when we go to the gym. This is the brain fitness that we all need. And there's a whole bunch of very specific things individuals can do to create the type of brain that does not fall for gaslighting. So I'm all about prevention. And I think that kind of one of the readers who's a combat medic, a veteran, he said, this is neurological armor for the brain. And I loved it. It was like such a good way of describing. But one thing I want to say, O'Brien, that you said that's really important for people to understand is during that grooming phase, if you're dealing with the dark triad, they are very carefully trying to draw you out and act like they care. And it's because they're trying to find your vulnerabilities. They want to know that your dad once said to you, you know what, you're a wimp and you've never forgotten it. It wounded you in a way that you can't seem to get better. Oh, once they know that story, you're doomed. You do not share your vulnerabilities with these individuals.
Yeah. The last thing I want to ask you is how should we think about high status people? Because we look at doctors and coaches and teachers and priests and all of these people. We have positions in our society that are high status. And oftentimes the biggest abuse scandals are coming from these places of power, right? People get themselves into a position of power as a priest and then they abuse that power and then they can also hide behind that institution. And so I think about this, just the work that I do in healthcare. Like I think about this with doctors where we have given so much blind faith to doctors. And yet doctors are human beings and fallible too. And we also need to be advocates for ourselves. I had a situation where my son swallowed a button battery, one of those little batteries. And we went in and they said, the protocol is we leave it for 4 days and see if it passes. And I was like, I know a bunch of reasons why this is probably not going to work. And my father-in-law is a gastroenterologist, so he is a doctor. And he was like, that doesn't sound right. And we pushed back and 2 people were like, well, it's the national standard. And we could see in the x-ray, it was right there. We know it's easy to go in and scope it and just get it right out. But we said, okay, we'll do it. And thank God he was okay. But when they scanned him 4 days later, it was sitting right there again. And when they finally did go in and just pull it right out, it was all corroded. And we were like, God, what damage did that do to our son? And it was just a good lesson that, like, we should, both my wife and I were like, we should have fought to be like, no, we should have advocated for ourselves and said, this is what it is. But this was two people in power telling us the standard, and we just fell in line with it. And so I'm not advocating for, like, don't listen to your doctor, go pretend you have more medical expertise than they do, or don't ever trust a coach, or don't ever trust a teacher, and you got to be like, they're all terrible. But at the same time, I just feel like we have to have a better check and balance in our own head. So I would love your thoughts or guidance on what is the right way to think about people in esteemed positions.
Yeah, I write extensively about that in the Gaslit Brain because it's one of the biggest issues. It's very difficult for our brain not to recognize the position. So I talk about really what I use the metaphor of progressive lenses. So anybody who's got glasses that has progressive lenses, you know that they allow you to see something up front, but also adapt very quickly to something in the distance. So if you go through the Gaslit Brain and you understand how these people operate, you can train yourself to be like someone wearing progressive glasses who doesn't just see Dr. Jekyll with the white coat or the priest with the religious garb or the suit of the CEO. One of the most famous books on this subject is Snakes in Suits. And that is about psychopathology. It's about, they present brilliantly. They are the smartest person in the room. And they can read you like a book. They know what makes you tick. They know everything about you. They know everything about everybody. They're unbelievable. The only problem is their affective empathy is damaged. And when someone has damaged affective empathy, they can hurt anyone. They can destroy the environment. They can hurt your kid. They don't care. They are able to do it, and they don't suffer any anguish because that part of their brain is extinguished. So you have to know that. You have to approach the world that way if you want to be psychologically safe, you want your kids safe, whatever. You don't want to get a misdiagnosis. What's so hard about the second opinion? We're very afraid, really deeply afraid. We're more afraid of disobeying than we are of getting hurt. And so that's being hammered into us in the school system. And I'm not saying anything bad about the school system. I don't want any of my fellow teachers.
There's a lot of improvements that could be made in the school system.
There's definitely improvements, but it's not the teacher's fault. I think that one of the best things I've ever read, and I write about it in The Bullied Brain, is Stanley Milgram's research. And this was in the 1960s, and we still haven't really learned. But in the 1960s, he did a bunch of research at Yale. He calls it the perils of obedience. And he shows that we're taught to obey in school. We're taught to have compliance. That's what they really want out of us. They don't want us to be the best and the brightest and the most incredible athlete or artist. They really want us to sit on our desk and respect the teacher. And as soon as it's hammered into you as a kid that an adult in your world called a teacher or a coach or a priest, whatever the religious denomination, that they have the power to say who you are, we're institutionalizing gaslighting. No one tells you who you are. They can give a snapshot of what they know from their limited world of whatever it is, athletics, arts, or academics. Sure. Great. Give me a snapshot of where this person is in time. And from your expertise, that's great. That doesn't really tell you anything about their character, their potential, who they could be, what they could do if they actually put in time to brain training. You don't know. And, I use the example when I present to people. A really good example of this is Tom Brady. So Tom Brady, if you don't know him, he's a quarterback, one of the most famous quarterbacks in the world. And when he was drafted 199th, and the reason he was drafted 199th is because they looked at him and they went, tall, skinny, white guy, that is not a quarterback. He got drafted. And what they didn't do is they didn't look at his brain. So they had no idea that Tom Brady had this superior brain.
He's a psychopath in a different way.
He's a psychopath. But having an unbelievable brain doesn't mean you're not a psychopath. When I say do a brain scan on him, I'm not saying, because the guys drafting, they don't care if he's got affective empathy or not. Now, if he was the CEO or you're going to marry him, you probably would want to know how his affective empathy is doing. And we should be doing this with leaders. We shouldn't have leaders of countries that we haven't looked at the brain scan and assessed their affective empathy. Because if it's missing, if it is deactivated and eroded, they're going to be an incredibly dangerous person. And you don't give nuclear codes to a very dangerous person. It doesn't make sense. But with Tom Brady, he does brain training. And so he's a 40-something brain that's outperforming 20-something brains. Why? Because he puts in the work. And every single one of us can do that. So Yeah, this perils of obedience is very serious. We should not be training our children to obey authority, and that the authority has the right to say who they are and what they will be, and open and close doors for them. That is way too much power. And kids should be taught that they should respect everyone. They should respect their teacher, but sometimes adults are dangerous and they need to know that, not just strangers, adults that they know. And this is the
Usually
language they
it's
need.
adults they know.
Adults
Yeah.
say no, and they need the language to report. One of the most interesting neuroscience things is if you don't have the language to describe your own experience, you can't experience it. And this is what happens in the abuse world because we don't give anybody, including adults, the vocabulary. A very advanced counterterrorism expert in the UK had never heard the word gaslighting, so he didn't know he was being gaslit at work. He didn't know how to describe it. He felt suicidal, but he didn't know that he was being gaslit.
Yeah. I appreciate you coming on here and giving us all the language to use around this topic. It is fascinating. I could pick your brain for the rest of the day. Thank you. We will link to the book. Was it Brain HQ? Was that what you said was the training?
Yep.
So we'll link to that and anything else that we talked about. But any final words that you want to say before we sign off?
I would only just say that anybody who's interested in this topic, I write a ton for Psychology Today. They're quick reads. If you want to follow up, that's just there for you. I'm very keen, like on a mission to get this information out there and happy to support anybody. So you can reach me through my website, just on the contact form, and I will try and support you as best I can in what you're doing in this field.
Fantastic. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Hope this has armed you and armed your brain so that you can navigate the world in a healthier way. Best of luck out there. Hey, folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.